Welcome to a full-speed, historically grounded journey through the rise and fall of ancient Egypt's kingdoms. This is not a list of greatest hits. This is the structural, political, environmental, and occasionally, how did anyone think this was a good idea anatomy of a civilization that survived almost everything: famine, civil war, invasions, and even its own bureaucracy. Now we begin at the only appropriate place. Before, Egypt was Egypt. Pre-dynastic origins and the unification of the two lands, c. 5000 to 3000 BCE. To understand Egypt's future obsessions, divine kingship, order versus chaos, monumental construction, and royal fashion that could snap your spine, you must begin in the pre-dynastic period. This is an age without pyramids, without pharaohs, and without the neat chronological comfort offered by later king lists. What we have instead is archaeology, pottery styles, burial customs, settlement patterns, and the first hints of a society learning that controlling the Nile is far more useful than simply living next to it. By around 5000 BCE, communities along the Nile Valley were transitioning from mobile pastoralism to permanent agriculture. The annual floods created a narrow corridor of hyper-fertile land, and this corridor shaped everything about Egyptian civilization. Centralized labor, predictable harvests, and an unspoken rule that life outside this green ribbon was basically a cosmic dare. As populations grew, these communities developed distinct cultural regions, most famously Nakada the Merton II and the Third cultures in Upper Egypt. Here we see social stratification emerge: elite burials with cosmetic palettes, ivory figurines, and early evidence of ritual authority. This is also where early iconography of power appears, including the falcon deity that will eventually evolve into Horus, the royal god par excellence. Egypt's political identity wasn't born in the throne room. It was incubated in cemeteries. By the late pre-dynastic period, Nakada III, the tempo accelerates. Settlements expand, pottery becomes standardized, trade networks stretch to Nubia, the Levant, and the Red Sea. More importantly, warfare imagery becomes explicit. The famous battlefield motifs, bound captives, smiting scenes, rows of dead, aren't artistic exaggerations. They are the propaganda of small competing polities carving out dominance. Egypt didn't unify through peaceful negotiation. It unified the same way most early states did. Someone won. Enter the figure at the heart of political myth-making, Narmer. Whether Narmer and Menes were the same person, or whether Menes is the result of ancient historians doing creative merging, the archaeological record places Narmer at the turning point. The Narmer palette, one of the most iconic Egyptian artifacts, shows a king wearing both the white crown, Upper Egypt, and the red crown, Lower Egypt. This is not a peaceful handshake moment. It is a visual thesis statement. I beat the North, I wear the crown, and please enjoy this curated selection of decapitated enemies. But the significance of the unification is deeper than military dominance. It is administrative. Narmer's reign, and perhaps the generation before and after him, creates the basic machinery of the Egyptian state: taxation systems, regional governors, controlled labor, centralized cults, and the ideological pairing of king and cosmos. The idea that the pharaoh maintains ma'at, the principle of order, begins here. It becomes the backbone of Egyptian political philosophy for 3 millennia. The transition into the early dynastic period, Dynasties 1 and 2, cements these changes. The capital at Memphis is established near the apex of the delta, a strategic location for controlling both Upper and Lower Egypt. Royal tombs at Abydos and Saqqara grow in scale and sophistication, already hinting at the monumental ambition soon to come. Bureaucratic titles multiply alarmingly, a phenomenon that will recur often. Ancient Egypt's true renewable resource was administrators. By the end of Dynasty II, Egypt is no longer a patchwork of river villages. It is a unified kingdom with a divine monarch, a working bureaucracy, a taxation system, and a worldview that merges politics with cosmology. The groundwork is laid for the Old Kingdom and for the architectural insanity that will define it. Dynasty III and the birth of monumental ambition, Djoser, Imhotep, and the First Pyramid. The Old Kingdom does not begin with pyramids. They erupt into existence after a long incubation of political centralization, ritual specialization, and a state apparatus increasingly obsessed with permanence. Dynasty III marks the point where Egypt shifts from complex chiefdom with a good accountant to monument-building machine with divine justification. At the center of this transformation stands Djoser, and behind him, a man who deserves a co-author credit for the entire Old Kingdom, Imhotep. Djoser's reign, 267-28 BCE, is the architectural Big Bang of Egypt. Prior royal complexes, mastabas, and elite tombs already hinted at growing state capacity, but they were still horizontal, sprawling but squat. Djoser and Imhotep introduced the vertical imperative. The step pyramid at Saqqara is not simply the first pyramid. It is a structural thesis on kingship. Built from stone rather than mud brick, a material choice only possible with centralized labor, skilled craftsmen, and logistical coordination. This monument announces that kingship has evolved into something divine, eternal, and unrepeatable by mere mortals. Imhotep's design reimagines the king's tomb not as a resting place, but as a cosmic machine. The complex surrounds the pyramid with courtyards, chapels, and ceremonial spaces that replicate structures used in life, implying that the afterlife requires a full administrative infrastructure. Egypt's elites would have understood the message. If the king needs this much space and stone when dead, imagine what he can command alive. The step pyramid is propaganda carved into limestone. Politically, Dynasty III consolidates the bureaucracy. Royal estates expand, officials overseeing granaries, workshops, and provincial centers gain specialized titles. The state begins to resemble a multi-layered organism whose sole purpose is to maintain the king's divine order. This is also when we see the first extensive use of stone construction for large-scale projects, which requires quarrying, transport, planning, and a labor force that is not enslaved but conscripted seasonally. Ordinary Egyptians participating in state projects as a civic religious duty. The shift from Abydos to Saqqara as the primary royal cemetery signals a geographic and ideological pivot. Saqqara, near Memphis, integrates the king with the administrative heartland. It also allows for expansion. The necropolis is vast, elevated, and close to the Nile. Nothing about its location is accidental. Dynastic ideology was not shy about symbolism, and burying the king near the capital under a mountain of stone sends a clear message to the nomes. All power flows from Memphis. Djoser's successors, Sekhemkhet, Kaba, Huni, continue this architectural experimentation, though often with incomplete projects. The buried pyramid of Sekhemkhet, for example, demonstrates the ambition to surpass Djoser in scale, but also reveals the limits of early pyramid logistics. Resource constraints, political transitions, or perhaps the classic "king died before we finished" problem curbed several projects. These failures are important. Each unfinished monument represents the state testing its boundaries and adjusting for the even more audacious plans of Dynasty IV. Artistic conventions also advance. Royal iconography solidifies around themes of authority. The king as smiter, the king as Horus, the king within architectural frames that emphasize isolation and divinity. Stone reliefs from the period, depict ceremonial running, royal rituals, and offerings that encode myths into political performance. If this seems like a lot of work just to say, the king is in charge, that is because Egypt understood early that power is most stable when ritualized, visualized, and carved into materials that outlast the people questioning it. By the end of Dynasty 3, Egypt possesses the political centralization, ideological justification, administrative machinery, and architectural know-how required for the next phase, the age of true pyramids. The step pyramid is merely the rehearsal. The main act, the Great Pyramid era, is about to begin, driven by kings who interpret monumental ambition not as metaphor but as personal challenge. Dynasties 4-6, the Pyramid Age, administrative expansion, and the first Great Collapse dynasties. 4-6 form the core of what is traditionally labeled the Old Kingdom, often marketed informally as the age when everyone decided bigger pyramids were always the correct answer. This period produces the most iconic monuments in Egyptian history, a bureaucracy capable of micromanaging an entire civilization, and finally the political and environmental stresses that expose the limits of this system. If Dynasty 3 is the prototype stage, Dynasty 4 is the architectural and ideological main event. The monumental zenith, Dynasty 4. The fourth dynasty introduces a lineage of kings with a shared obsession: stone, scale, and an afterlife that requires geometry on an unprecedented level. Sneferu, the dynasty's founder, is responsible for not one, but at least 3 major pyramids: the Bent Pyramid, the Red Pyramid, and likely the Meidum Pyramid. Sneferu is essentially the R&D department of ancient Egyptian architecture. The Bent Pyramid's mid-build angle change is either an engineering correction or the world's earliest documented case of "we can fix it in post." But this period refines the techniques, quarrying, transport systems, core-belled chambers, and processional complexes that make possible the next generation. That next generation is Khufu, architect of the Great Pyramid at Giza, a structure so precisely aligned and so mathematically disciplined that later Greeks assumed supernatural involvement because accepting Egyptian engineering superiority was emotionally inconvenient. The labor system here is critical. Workers were not slaves, but seasonally conscripted laborers supported by state provisioning. Excavated workers' villages show organized housing, bakeries, breweries, and medical care. This is a machine age. The state directs immense organizational capacity toward a single monumental purpose. Khafra and Menkaure continue the pyramid tradition at Giza, creating an architectural triad that serves as a permanent statement of Fourth Dynasty dominance. The Sphinx, likely associated with Khafra, introduces ideological imagery in colossal form. The king fused with the lion, a guardian of cosmic order. This fusion of royal power and monumental art cements the pharaoh not merely as ruler, but as metaphysical anchor. The bureaucratic apex, Dynasty 5. By Dynasty 5, something shifts. Pyramids shrink. This is not a crisis. It is an administrative recalibration. Rather than investing every resource into a single colossal tomb, the state begins distributing wealth and authority through an increasingly professional priesthood, especially the cult of Ra at Heliopolis. Solar temples proliferate, creating new ritual spaces that reflect the king's alignment with the sun god. Crucially, this dynasty also introduces pyramid texts, the earliest known religious writings carved inside royal tombs. These texts articulate a detailed cosmology and kingly afterlife, turning the burial chamber into a theological manuscript. The shift from external monumentality to internal ideational complexity reveals a maturing state ideology. Power is not just size, it is meaning. The long decline, Dynasty 6. Under Teti, Pepi the Wen, Merenre and Pepi II, administrative complexity reaches an extreme. Provincial officials, nomarchs, acquire increasing autonomy as they manage local irrigation, labor, and regional defense. The royal court becomes an elaborate hierarchy of titles, overseen by viziers who function as prime ministers, in a state whose central authority is becoming stretched thin. Pepi II's reign, possibly exceeding 60 years, creates a generational imbalance. As the king ages, regional elites consolidate power, marriages connect royal and provincial families, and the ideological centrality of the monarchy becomes harder to maintain. Long reigns are often destabilizing. They freeze political circulation, foster entrenched factions, and complicate succession. At the same time, environmental evidence suggests the Nile experienced repeated low inundations toward the end of the Old Kingdom. Since Egyptian agriculture depended entirely on predictable flooding, this triggered food shortages, economic contractions, and stress on the tax system. A centralized state built on agricultural surplus cannot withstand prolonged underproduction. Collapse into the First Intermediate Period. By the close of Dynasty VI, the Old Kingdom system, monumental kingship, rigid centralization, and a vast bureaucratic apparatus, loses coherence. Nomarchs assert independence, royal construction projects halt, and political fragmentation sets in. The collapse is not instantaneous but progressive, a slow erosion of authority culminating in a patchwork of regional powers. The Pyramid Age ends not with a dramatic overthrow, but with systemic fatigue. The Old Kingdom had stretched its administrative, environmental, and ideological capacity to the limit. The next centuries will show what happens when the ideology of the king maintains order, is tested by a world that refuses to cooperate. The First Intermediate Period, regional fragmentation, competing centers, and the reunification under Mentuhotep II. The First Intermediate Period, c. 2181, 2055 BCE, is what happens when a hyper-centralized state experiences prolonged environmental stress, political stagnation, and administrative overgrowth. The Old Kingdom didn't implode spectacularly, it unraveled. What followed was a century and a half of regionalism, competing dynasties, local innovation, and eventually the emergence of a ruler capable of stitching the fractured Nile Valley back together. This is Egypt's first major political reset, fragmentation, when the nomarchs become kings in all but name. As Dynasty VI faded, power leaked from Memphis to the provinces. Nomarchs, once administrators, now acted as local kings, controlling irrigation, local militias, and vast estates. Their tombs grow grander, decorated with autobiographies that read like LinkedIn profiles, with more smiting. These inscriptions reveal real anxiety, failed harvests, banditry, and the breakdown of reliable transport. When a civilization depends on the Nile's inundation as its heartbeat, several weak floods in a row are practically a political assassination. Two main centers crystallize: Heracleopolis, Lower Middle Egypt, ruled by the 9th and 10th dynasties, which claim legitimacy through inheritance of Old Kingdom administrative traditions. Thebes, Upper Egypt, ruled by the 11th dynasty, a rising power fueled by a cohesive local elite and a growing cult of Amun. Neither side has the resources to dominate immediately, and Egypt enters its most decentralized era so far. Yet this decentralization isn't pure chaos. Local art flourishes. Coffin texts develop from the earlier pyramid texts, democratizing afterlife spells that previously belonged only to kings. Literature such as the dialogue of a man with his bar and the tale of the eloquent peasant reflects a world struggling with justice, order, and leadership, issues likely far less philosophical when experienced firsthand. Heracleopolis, the administrators who refused to quit. The Heracleopolitan kings attempt to preserve old kingdom structures, but their control is thin. They rely on alliances with key nomarchs, particularly in Middle Egypt, and try to project authority through limited military campaigns and infrastructural maintenance. They commission temples, manage canals, and issue decrees intended to stabilize regional relationships. But without the wealth of a unified Nile, their administrative style borders on ceremonial. They can claim legitimacy, but they cannot impose it. Thebes, a young power with a cohesive mission. Meanwhile, the Thebans evolve from a local dynasty into a rival state. They consolidate Upper Egypt militarily and ideologically, cultivating a local version of kingship, emphasizing strength, divine favor, and regional unity. The 11th dynasty rulers, especially Intef II and Intef III, expand their control northward, challenging Heracleopolitan boundaries and reshaping the political map. Thebes benefits from two strategic advantages: a more cohesive local elite and tighter integration between military leadership and royal authority. Their rule is also less constrained by Old Kingdom precedent, allowing them to innovate ideologically. The rise of Amun begins here, not yet supreme, but increasingly important in Theban identity. The turning point, Mentuhotep II and the reunification of Egypt. The conflict culminates under Mentuhotep II, 61-2010 BCE, a ruler of the 11th dynasty who transforms Thebes from a regional power into a national force. His campaigns gradually crush Heracleopolitan influence. The reunification was not a single climactic battle, but a series of strategic advances, sieges, and territorial consolidations. When Heracleopolis finally collapses, Mentuhotep II declares himself king of a unified Egypt, inaugurating the Middle Kingdom, a period many historians regard as the intellectual and administrative high point of ancient Egypt. Mentuhotep's mortuary complex at Deir el-Bahri embodies his new vision of kingship. It diverges from Old Kingdom pyramid design, blending terraced architecture with cliffside integration. The structure announces a new era, one in which the king's divine role is re-articulated, more militarized, more ideological, and perhaps more self-aware after a century of fragmentation. The first intermediate period in retrospect. This era is not a dark age. It is a recalibration. Local elites adapt, religious texts democratize, artistic traditions diversify, and political centers compete in ways that ultimately sharpen Egypt's capacity for renewal. Mentuhotep II's reunification doesn't simply restore the Old Kingdom. It paves the way for the Middle Kingdom's refined bureaucratic systems, stronger kingship, and cultural renaissance. The Middle Kingdom, Dynasties 11-12, and the reimagining of Egyptian kingship. The Middle Kingdom, c. 2035-1650 BCE, is Egypt's great renaissance, political, administrative, artistic, and ideological. If the Old Kingdom is the age of monumental ego, the Middle Kingdom is the age of refinement, a state that has learned from fragmentation, rebuilt its institutions, and crafted a more flexible and sophisticated model of kingship. Dynasties 11 and 12 form the core of this transformation, establishing a dynastic blueprint that later Egyptians looked back on as the golden standard of governance. Pharaohs of the New Kingdom routinely tried to imitate these rulers, not the pyramid builders. Mentuhotep II, founder of the new order. Although Mentuhotep II began in the first intermediate period, his later reign effectively inaugurates the Middle Kingdom. His reunification campaigns validate a new kind of pharaonic identity, one forged not by inherited divine order, but by active restoration. His rule emphasizes military discipline, ideological reconstruction, and a clearer integration between state and temple. The mortuary complex at Deir el-Bahri reflects this shift, using terraced architecture and visual symmetry to signal a king who restores balance through deliberate, organized action rather than sheer monumentality. Under Mentuhotep II and his successors, Egypt regains territorial stability. Trade with Nubia, Byblos, and the Eastern Desert is restored. Mining expeditions resume. Administrative reforms begin to take shape. The state is no longer a top-heavy Old Kingdom bureaucracy, but a leaner, more responsive machine. The rise of Dynasty 12. Administrative genius in crown form. If the Middle Kingdom has a golden dynasty, it is Dynasty 12, founded by Amenemhat II. He rises from non-royal origins, likely a high-ranking official, before taking the throne, which gives his reign a pragmatic orientation. This is a pharaoh who sees the machine from inside before operating it from above. His decision to move the capital to Ichtawi, likely near modern Lisht, is strategic. The location sits between Upper and Lower Egypt, allowing tighter control of both regions, easier oversight of the Fayum, and swifter deployment of military units. It is a capital built not for symbolism, but for efficiency. Amenemhat I and Senusret. The Great Partnership. Amenemhat I establishes a policy that will define Dynasty 12, co-regency. By elevating his son Senusret I as co-ruler before death, he ensures continuity and eliminates succession crises. This system stabilizes Egypt for generations. Senusret I expands state power through construction, military campaigns, and ideological consolidation. He strengthens fortifications along the Nile, particularly in Lower Nubia, and commissions temples that reinforce the king's universal role. His architectural program is extensive but measured, never the excesses of the Old Kingdom. This dynasty didn't build pyramids to outperform ancestors. It built them because order requires ritual consistency. Senusret III. Militaristic efficiency and territorial control. One of the most formidable rulers in Egyptian history, Senusret III embodies Middle Kingdom kingship at its sharpest. His reign marks the height of centralized power. Nomarchs are systematically reduced or eliminated, replacing hereditary regional elites with appointed officials loyal to the crown. This creates a more unified hierarchy, but also removes regional aristocrats who previously acted as buffers during crisis. It is state centralization in textbook form. Senusret III also campaigns aggressively in Nubia, constructing a chain of fortresses, Buhan, Semna, Uronati, that regulate trade, restrict movement, and project Egyptian authority deep into Kush. These fortresses are not symbolic. They are functional military administrative hubs, complete with barracks, storage facilities, and command hierarchies. His image shifts toward a hyper-realistic aesthetic. Heavy-lidded eyes, furrowed brows, and a stern, almost exhausted demeanor. This is ideological theater, kingship portrayed as burden and responsibility rather than eternal youth. The Middle Kingdom understands power as labor. Amenemhat III, economic mastery and hydraulic control. Amenemhat III presides over an era of prosperity. His management of the Fayum is particularly notable. Massive irrigation works transform the region into fertile agricultural land, expanding Egypt's resource base. This is state-directed environmental engineering on a scale unmatched since the early dynastic era. He builds pyramids at Dashur and Hawara. The latter is associated with the labyrinth, described by later Greek authors, a massive administrative and ceremonial complex that impressed ancient travelers. The Middle Kingdom's cultural achievement literature flourishes. The story of Sinuhe, the instructions of Amenemhat, the prophecy of Neferti, the shipwrecked sailor. These works explore loyalty, kingship, fate, and identity with psychological depth unmatched by earlier periods. Coffin texts evolve further, democratizing access to funerary knowledge. Art becomes refined, sober, and technically sophisticated. Mathematical papyri, legal documents, and administrative records show a state that values precision. Closing of the Middle Kingdom core. By the end of Dynasty 12, Egypt stands at its intellectual and administrative peak. But the very centralization that strengthens the state also creates rigidity, and the dynastic line weakens as successors become less capable. The stage is set for fragmentation, internal strain, and foreign encroachment, the forces that will usher in the second intermediate period. The late Middle Kingdom, Dynasties 13-14, and the slow unraveling of centralized power. The brilliance of Dynasty 12 casts a long shadow, and Dynasties 13 and 14 live inside that shadow. What follows is not an immediate collapse, but a progressive thinning of authority, a political environment in which the structures built by earlier rulers continue functioning, briefly, without the strength or charisma at the top to hold them together. The late Middle Kingdom is a case study in how a highly centralized system weakens, not through one catastrophic event, but through dilution, overextension, and the loss of administrative cohesion. Dynasty 13, too many kings, too little authority. Dynasty 13, c. 1803-1649 BCE, begins as a nominal continuation of the Middle Kingdom system, but quickly becomes one of the most king-saturated periods in Egyptian history. The exact number of rulers remains debated due to poor preservation and conflicting king lists, but estimates often exceed 30 pharaohs in less than 2 centuries. Political instability isn't subtle here. It's printed directly onto the chronological record. Most 13th dynasty kings reign for only a few years, sometimes mere months. This rapid turnover signals profound structural stress. Succession is no longer stable, and co-regency, a successful strategy in Dynasty 12, disappears. Provincial autonomy resurges, with local elites asserting practical control, even if they still nominally acknowledge a king. The capital at Ichtawi weakens as a central command node. Its authority becomes symbolic rather than operational. And yet, the state doesn't completely fall apart. Bureaucratic inertia keeps things functioning. Egypt's civil servants continue filing documents, collecting taxes, organizing corvée labor, and maintaining temples. The system runs, just poorly. Archaeology from this period reveals administrative papyri full of standardized procedures, but often with mistakes, corrections, or signs of multiple overlapping offices. It's the corporate equivalent of a company still operating on photocopies of a handbook no one has updated in decades. Economic strain and environmental pressure. There is evidence that the Nile's inundations became less predictable. Fluctuating floods, neither extreme famine nor reliable abundance, produce recurring instability. Egypt's economy, tightly tied to agricultural surpluses, suffers from this volatility. Royal building projects diminish, not because the ideology changes, but because the kings lack the economic base to fund them. Pyramid construction disappears. Burial practices shift towards smaller, more modest tombs. The state's resources are stretched thin, and prestige architecture is no longer feasible. Rise of Dynasty 14. The Delta breaks away. Parallel to Dynasty 13, Dynasty 14 emerges in the Eastern Delta. This dynasty likely consists of a group of rulers, possibly of local or mixed Levantine origin, who take advantage of weak central power to establish autonomy. Whether they were independent from the beginning or gradually broke away is debated, but their existence represents the formal start of Egypt's political fragmentation. Key characteristics of Dynasty 14. They control important delta trade routes connected to the Levant. They maintain their own administrative structures and local cults. Their kings appear in local documents but rarely in national ones. The delta environment, marshy, economically diverse, and connected to external trade networks, has long been the region most resistant to full centralization. When central power weakens, the delta is the first to go its own way. A precarious duality. By the mid-17th century BCE, Egypt is essentially split. Dynasty 13, ruling Middle and Upper Egypt with diminishing influence. Dynasty 14, ruling the Eastern Delta autonomously. Neither dynasty commands the full apparatus of Middle Kingdom power. Both operate in shrinking spheres, unable to project authority effectively. This duality creates conditions for something unprecedented in Egyptian history: the arrival of a new foreign ruling class that will reshape the political landscape for more than a century. Setting the stage for the Hyksos, the fragmentation of dynasties. 13 and 14 weakens Egypt's defensive capacities and opens the delta to increased migration and settlement from Western Asia. These groups, already present for generations, will eventually consolidate into the Hyksos, forming Egypt's next major power center. The Middle Kingdom, which began as a story of reunification and refined kingship, ends as a demonstration of what happens when a state relies too heavily on institutional memory and not enough on institutional strength. Egypt is about to enter another age of competing powers, foreign rulers, and hard lessons about borders and sovereignty. The Second Intermediate Period and the rise of the Hyksos, foreign lords of the Delta. The Second Intermediate Period, c. 1650–1550 BCE, is Egypt's most structurally exposed era since the First Intermediate Period. But the causes and consequences are very different. What begins as internal fragmentation in dynasties 13 and 14 evolves into a geopolitical shift: the emergence of a foreign dynasty in the heart of the Delta, ruling as legitimate kings of Egypt. The Hyksos, whose name comes from the Egyptian Heka Chasut, rulers of foreign lands, do not arrive as invaders crashing through Egypt's borders in a single dramatic moment. They rise through settlement, integration, opportunism, and the vacuum left by a weakened central state. A weak Egypt provides an opening. By the early 17th century BCE, the Egyptian state is effectively divided. Dynasty 13, still claiming rule over Middle and Upper Egypt, but in reality presiding over ever-shrinking political authority. Dynasty 14, controlling parts of the Eastern Delta, fragmented, likely with rulers of mixed local and Levantine backgrounds. Neither dynasty has the political cohesion, economic base, or military power to control the Delta's trade routes or prevent the steady influx of Western Asiatic groups. These communities, long present as merchants, craftsmen, and migrants, gradually accumulate economic and social influence. When Egypt's central power dissolves, they are positioned perfectly to step into the political space. The rise of Avaris and the formation of Hyksos power. The key to Hyksos emergence is Avaris, modern Tel El Daba, a thriving port city in the northeastern delta, strategically placed on routes connecting Egypt with the Levant, Cyprus, and the wider Near East. Excavations reveal a cosmopolitan population with Levantine-style burials, domestic architecture, pottery traditions, and even religious practices coexisting alongside Egyptian elements. Rather than a violent conquest, the Hyksos ascend as military leaders who control vital trade routes, administrators who exploit the collapse of Dynasty 14, local elites who adopt Egyptian royal ideology to legitimize their rule. Once established, the Hyksos rulers begin using pharaonic titulary, issuing scarabs, commissioning monuments, and embedding themselves within Egyptian tradition, while maintaining many Near Eastern cultural traits. Hyksos kingship, hybrid by design. The Hyksos ruling line, known as Dynasty 15, adopts a hybrid political identity: Egyptian in titulary, kingship style, and religious language, Levantine in material culture, military technologies, and certain cultic practices. This blending is not superficial. The Hyksos rulers effectively integrate themselves into the broader Egyptian political landscape by imitating its administrative forms while modifying them to suit their own networks and military structures. They also introduce key military innovations: horse-drawn chariots, composite bows, new bronze weaponry, improved fortification methods. These technologies give them a significant advantage over the weakened southern dynasties. The Egyptian response. Thebes regroups. While the Hyksos consolidate the delta, Thebes re-emerges as a formidable southern power. The 16th and early 17th dynasties rule Upper Egypt, developing a distinct identity based on resistance and regional pride. Key rulers like Sekenenretau, Kamose, and eventually Ahmose-Them interpret the Hyksos presence not as a temporary political arrangement, but as a cosmic violation of Egyptian order. Royal narratives portray the struggle as mythic: foreigners occupying the land of the gods, chaos threatening Maat. This ideological framing gives Thebes a powerful unifying narrative and a clear military purpose. Conflict and expulsion. By the reign of Kamose, Thebes transitions from containment to offensive action. He launches campaigns northwards, disrupting Hyksos supply routes and attacking allied centers. His stelae portray him as the liberator of Egypt, though his campaigns stop short of full victory. The final expulsion is achieved by Ahmose I, founder of the new kingdom. He besieges Avaris, drives the Hyksos out of the delta, and pursues them into southern Canaan to prevent their return. What the Hyksos era really means. The Hyksos episode is not an embarrassing interruption in Egyptian history. It is a structural turning point. It shocks Egypt into militarization. It exposes the vulnerabilities of over-centralization. It brings foreign technologies and military strategies into Egypt. It drives the ideological evolution that will define the new kingdom as an expansionist empire rather than an insular kingdom. The Hyksos do not simply rule Egypt, they transform it, forcing the state to rethink kingship, borders, and military capacity. The consequences will echo through the next 500 years. The early New Kingdom, Ahmose-Them, and the birth of the Egyptian Empire. The early New Kingdom, c. 1550–1479 BCE, is Egypt's transformation from a resilient but inward-looking kingdom into an outward-facing imperial power. The pivot begins with one ruler, whose reign marks the most decisive transition since Narmer, Ahmose I, the founder of the 18th dynasty. His victory over the Hyksos is only the prologue. The true significance of his rule lies in how he restructures Egypt into an expansionist, militarized, aggressively centralized state prepared to dominate the political landscape of the Near East. Ahmose-Them, restorer, innovator, and reluctant imperialist. Ahmose inherits a mission, not a throne. His predecessors, Sekenenretau and Kamose, initiated the war against the Hyksos, but their victories were partial and costly. Ahmose completes the task, but in doing so discovers a truth that will define the new kingdom. Egypt can no longer afford to be passive. External threats require external control. His campaigns begin with the methodical destruction of Hyksos power, siege of Avaris, the Hyksos capital, pursuit of Hyksos forces into southern Canaan to neutralize their capacity to regroup, securing the northeastern frontier with garrisons and strategic oversight. These actions set a precedent. Earlier Egyptian kings occasionally raided abroad, but Ahmose institutionalizes the logic: safety through dominance. Internal reunification, the machinery of the new kingdom. Ahmose's victories give him legitimacy, but he must rebuild the state that the Hyksos era fractured. His reforms are not ceremonial. they are structural. Consolidation of Theban power. Thebes becomes the ideological capital, its god Amun linked explicitly with royal victory. Temple endowments expand dramatically, intertwining religious authority with political power in ways that amplify both. Administrative reforms offices weakened in the Second Intermediate Period are re-established, but with tighter oversight. Local elites are rewarded for loyalty, yet prevented from forming independent power bases. Titles proliferate, but their holders remain firmly tied to the crown. Military restructuring. The Hyksos introduced horses, chariots, composite bows, and new fortification styles. Ahmose not only adopts these technologies, he integrates them into a professionalized military system with ranks, recorded honors, and clear chains of command. Military service becomes a pathway to wealth and status, strengthening royal control. Economic recovery. With order restored, Egypt reopens mines in the Sinai, revives Nubian trade routes, and restores tribute flows. Massive building projects stimulate labor organization, demonstrating the restored state's capacity. The Nubian campaigns, securing the south. Once the Delta and Levant are stabilized, Ahmose turns south. Nubia, which had broken free during the Hyksos period, is subdued through a series of campaigns. The region is not merely pacified, it is absorbed into a new administrative structure. Egyptian viceroys, the king's son of Kush, govern Nubia. Fortresses such as Buhan and Aniba become tax and military centers. Gold mines are reopened, providing wealth that fuels the new kingdom's imperial ambitions. This southern consolidation is critical. Nubian gold will bankroll Egypt's future diplomacy, temples, and armies. The Ahmose ideological blueprint. Ahmose crafts a new political narrative. The king as warrior unifier. Instead of simply maintaining order, the pharaoh now creates it through military initiative. Victory becomes a divine mandate. Amun becomes the god who grants conquest. Temples absorb spoils of war, linking expansion with sacred economics. This ideological recalibration sets the stage for the new kingdom's hallmark, a fusion of religious legitimacy, military aggression, and administrative sophistication. From restoration to empire. Ahmose does not see himself as an emperor in the later sense, but he lays every foundation required for empire. Permanent garrisons beyond Egypt's borders, a professional army, a wealthy, temple-centered economy, a sacralized ideology of conquest, reunified political structure rooted in Theban divine kingship. His successors, Amenhotep II, Thutmose III, Hatshepsut, Thutmose III, inherit a nation reorganized for expansion. They will turn border security into territorial acquisition, sporadic campaigns into systemic dominance, and royal victory into a cosmic expectation. The early New Kingdom, in context Ahmose, closes the Second Intermediate Period. But more importantly, he inaugurates the phase historians often call Imperial Egypt. His reign marks the moment when Egypt stops reacting to foreign powers and begins shaping the geopolitical environment around it. The next rulers will transform this restored Egypt into a transcontinental empire, but Ahmose provides the essential machinery, ideology, and momentum. Hatshepsut, Thutmose III, and the architecture of the Egyptian Empire. The rise of Hatshepsut and Thutmose III marks the period in which Egypt transitions from a kingdom with expansionist tendencies into a fully articulated imperial system. Their reigns, interlocked, overlapping, and ideologically distinct, forge the administrative, military, and economic structures that will define the new kingdom's century of dominance. If Ahmose built the machinery, Hatshepsut calibrates it, and Thutmose III pushes it to maximum capacity. Hatshepsut, stability, wealth, and a new model of kingship. Hatshepsut begins as queen regent for the young Thutmose III, but within a few years assumes full pharaonic authority. Her reign differs in style from later military kings, but it is no less significant. She stabilizes Egypt internally, strengthens its economy, expands trade networks, and invests heavily in religious legitimacy. Her approach to power draws on three pillars: ideological legitimacy. She presents herself as the chosen of Amun, acting out divine birth narratives and deploying iconography that fuses traditional kingship with her unique status. Her propaganda is subtle, consistent, and unmistakably effective. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri, a masterpiece of symmetry, axial design, and cliffside integration, becomes the architectural symbol of her rule. Economic expansion. Her famous Punt expedition is not a novelty, but a calculated strategic investment. Punt provides incense, exotic goods, and trade connections that enrich temple complexes. The fleet demonstrates Egypt's logistical capability, projecting soft power rather than military might. Domestic strengthening. Hatshepsut organizes ambitious building programs, restoring temples damaged during the Hyksos era, and expanding Amun's cultic infrastructure. This strengthens the priesthood and ties them closely to the crown, an alliance with long-lasting consequences. Her reign is peaceful, stable, and economically prosperous. However, it is not static. By elevating Egypt's wealth and religious institutions, she sets the groundwork that allows the next phase, territorial expansion, to unfold at an unprecedented scale. Transition of power from regent to warrior. King. When Hatshepsut dies, Thutmose III finally rules alone. He inherits a wealthy kingdom, a strengthened priesthood, a professionalized military, a stable administrative corps, a network of vassals already showing signs of rebellion, and, crucially, the pressure to project Egyptian authority abroad. Thutmose III responds decisively. His reign becomes the template for Egyptian imperial kingship. Thutmose III, the Napoleon of the ancient world, with better record-keeping. Thutmose III wages at least 17 documented campaigns over 2 decades, primarily in the Levant and Syria. His strategy is not reckless expansion. It is systematic creation of an imperial buffer zone. Key elements: rapid mobilization and strategic surprise. The Battle of Megiddo is his iconic victory, achieved by marching his army through the narrow Aruna Pass, an action many contemporaries likely considered insane. The risk pays off. The Canaanite coalition is routed, and Megiddo becomes a precedent for future operations. Conquest and administration, not annihilation. Thutmose does not attempt to wipe out rivals. Instead, he reshapes the political map. Local rulers remain in place, but must send hostages to Egypt. Tributes are formalized. Garrisons and commissioners enforce compliance. Fortresses secure key routes. This is empire by managed hierarchy, not direct occupation. Economic integration. Tribute from Syria, Canaan, and Nubia flows into Egypt. Horses, chariots, copper, timber, wine, luxury items, and skilled captives. This wealth funds temples, state projects, and continued campaigns. The imperial economy is not a side effect, but the system's engine. Diplomatic networks. Egypt becomes an active player in Near Eastern diplomacy. Thutmose's reign marks the beginning of the complex international arena seen in the Amarna period. Gifts, treaties, marriages, and correspondence form an interstate ecosystem, building the imperial state. The combined legacy of Hatshepsut and Thutmose III yields a fully realized imperial system. Military, professional, mobile, technologically advanced, ideologically supported. Administration, streamlined, centralized, with provincial oversight extending beyond Egypt's borders. Religion, Amun's supremacy fortified by conquest, temples become economic powerhouses. Economy: tribute-based, trade-driven, expansion-funded. Ideology: Pharaoh as universal ruler, chosen by the gods to impose order beyond Egypt's natural borders. Their partnership, part sequential, part parallel, creates the high-functioning imperial machine that will define the rest of the 18th dynasty and influence Egyptian political philosophy until the very end of pharaonic history. Amenhotep III and the Diplomatic Golden Age. Power without war with Amenhotep III, Egmau 1390–1352 BCE. Egypt reaches the height of its international prestige, a period historians often label the Diplomatic Golden Age. This era stands out not because Egypt expands militarily, but because it doesn't need to. Amenhotep III inherits an empire already stabilized by Thutmose III's campaigns and maintained by efficient administrators. Instead of conquering, he rules through prestige, wealth, marriage alliances, monumental building, and the kind of international diplomacy that makes later emperors seem unsubtle. Egypt, at this moment, is the superpower of the late Bronze Age world. The kings of Babylon, Mitanni, Hatti, and Assyria treat Amenhotep not as an equal, but as the partner they must impress, flatter, or appease. The royal archives known as the Amarna letters, though slightly later, reflect a world where Amenhotep III's Egypt sits at the diplomatic center of a vast, interconnected system of great kings. A king whose wars were mostly ceremonial. Unlike the warrior pharaohs before him, Amenhotep III conducts few actual military campaigns. The empire's borders are secure, major threats are subdued. Garrisons in Nubia and Canaan maintain order, and frontier systems function independently. His army remains strong, but is rarely mobilized for major conflict. Instead of expanding territories, he expands influence. This is why Amenhotep III's reign is sometimes described as Egypt's soft power empire. Tribute continues to flow from vassals. Neighboring kings send gifts and daughters, and Egypt's internal prosperity grows without the need for destructive campaigns. It is the ancient equivalent of a geopolitical flex. Why fight when everyone already agrees you're in charge? Marriage diplomacy. The pharaoh as the world's most eligible monarch. Amenhotep III elevates diplomatic marriage into a systematic political tool. He marries princesses from Mitanni, Babylonia, Arzawa, the Levant. These marriages are not romantic gestures. They are strategic exchanges that bind foreign courts to Egypt through kinship and prestige. A distinctive rule emerges. Egypt never sends its own princesses abroad. Foreign kings complain about this endlessly in letters. Amenhotep's polite responses translate roughly to, Egyptian royal women do not marry outside Egypt, but yes, you may send me your daughter. It is an asymmetrical system that reinforces Egypt's superior position. The cultic and monumental explosion. Amenhotep III channels Egypt's wealth into building projects that rival anything from the Old Kingdom, though with a different aesthetic and ideological focus. Instead of pyramids, he invests in expansions of Karnak-Luxor Temple, his massive ceremonial palace complex at Malkata, the monumental colossi that once guarded his mortuary temple, known today as the Colossi of Memnon. His temples emphasize solar worship, royal divinity, and cosmic harmony. Artistic styles shift toward elegance, refinement, and subtle detail. Portraits depict the king in serene, idealized forms that convey confidence, stability, and divine favor. The state radiates wealth through artistry instead of conquests. This monumental strategy has a clear political purpose: to embed Amenhotep III's reign into the sacred landscape so permanently that no successor could erase it, though one successor will certainly try to redirect its legacy. Egypt and Mitanni. a diplomatic masterstroke. One of Amenhotep's most significant achievements is the stabilization of relations with Mitanni, a powerful kingdom in northern Syria. Instead of fighting over influence in the Levant, he uses gifts, marriage alliances, honorific titles, diplomacy managed by elite envoys. This transforms Mitanni from a rival into a partner. Peace with Mitanni reduces the threat from the Hittites, allowing Egypt to preserve its northern sphere without costly conflict. Egypt's vassals in Canaan send tribute, warriors, and resources. The empire remains coherent through indirect rule rather than direct occupation. Amenhotep III as divine king. His reign pushes royal divinity to new heights. He assumes increasingly sacred titles, participates in solar festivals, and celebrates his first said festival unusually early, likely to emphasize rejuvenation and eternal kingship. State ideology becomes more explicitly cosmic. This shift toward divine kingship and solar identity will set the stage, intentionally or not, for the religious upheaval of his son, Amenhotep IV Akhenaten, the diplomatic golden age in retrospect. Amenhotep III's era is not defined by conquest, but by equilibrium. It is a period in which Egypt is at maximum wealth, diplomacy outperforms war, international prestige replaces battlefield glory, art and architecture flourish. The empire governs through stability rather than expansion. This is Egypt at its most confident, and perhaps its most complacent. The next reign will break this equilibrium dramatically, reshaping religion, politics, and ideology in ways that shake the empire to its core. Akhenaten and the Amarna Revolution, ideology as earthquake. The reign of Akhenaten, Sakyum 1352-1336 BCE, is the single most disruptive ideological experiment in all of Egyptian history. What begins as a shift in religious emphasis becomes a total reconfiguration of kingship, art, ritual, and political geography. Egypt has experienced foreign dynasties, civil wars, and collapses, but never before had a pharaoh attempted to rewrite the cosmic order from the ground up. The Amarna period is not a footnote. It is a shockwave. Prelude, Amenhotep IV. Before the break, Akhenaten begins his reign as Amenhotep IV, inheriting a prosperous, diplomatically stable empire from Amenhotep III. The state is wealthy, international relations are well managed, and temple complexes, especially those of Amun, are at the peak of their power. This last point is crucial. The Amun priesthood at Thebes has become a parallel power structure, wealthy, deeply embedded in administration, and ideologically essential to the new kingdom. Priests control land, labor, and sacred authority. Any king seeking to recenter power must contend with them. Amenhotep IV's early inscriptions hint at discomfort with Theban orthodoxy. He begins promoting a solar deity, Aten, represented not as a falcon or human form, but as a radiant disk with hands reaching out from its rays. The symbolism signals abstraction, universality, and a bypassing of traditional cult images. The break from Amenhotep IV to Akhenaten. Around year 5 of his reign, the king takes a dramatic step. He changes his name to Akhenaten, effective for the Aten. He abandons Thebes. He found a brand new capital, Akhetaten, modern Amarna, dedicated entirely to Aten's worship. This relocation is not symbolic. It is logistical warfare against the Amun priesthood. By founding a completely new city, Akhenaten frees himself from the entrenched religious bureaucracy and constructs a new ideological world from scratch. The new capital is designed for transparency and ritual performance. Open temples without roofs, broad processional roads, giant stelae marking sacred boundaries. Aten is worshipped under the open sky, emphasizing direct divine radiance rather than enclosed sanctuaries. Atenism, not monotheism, but monopolistic monolatry. Scholars debate whether Atenism is true monotheism. The more precise term is exclusive state monolatry. Aten is the only god worthy of worship. Other gods are not denied as existing. They are simply banned from cult practice. Temples of other gods are closed or defunded. Amun's name is literally chiseled out from inscriptions across Egypt. This is ideological centralization as religious policy. Aten is conceptualized not as a relatable deity, but as a cosmic force, distant, radiant, abstract. Personal piety vanishes from official art. Ritual becomes the exclusive domain of the royal family, with Akhenaten and Nefertiti acting as intermediaries between humanity and the solar disk. This is not just a new religion. It is a new cosmological constitution, with the king as the sole authorized interpreter. The Amarna aesthetic. Art as ideological weapon. Amarna art marks a radical shift from traditional Egyptian representation. Elongated skulls, protruding stomachs, narrow limbs, androgynous royal features, intimate family scenes, rigid axial symmetry, replaced by fluid composition. These distortions are not caricature. They encode theological ideas. Aten's divine radiance reshapes its chosen ones. Akhenaten's body is not a portrait, but a visual argument. The king is fundamentally different from ordinary humans. Family scenes of Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and their daughters under the Aten's rays reinforce the idea that divinity flows through the royal household alone. The empire suffers, while the king theologizes. While Akhenaten refocuses the entire state apparatus on religious transformation, Egypt's imperial system begins to strain. Vassals in Canaan and Syria plead for military aid against Hittite expansion. The Amarna letters show increasing desperation from loyal cities under threat. Akhenaten appears disengaged from foreign affairs, responding too slowly, or not at all, while diplomatic networks unravel. Egypt's soft power erodes, and its northern sphere contracts. The Hittites fill the vacuum, the human cost, and the rapid collapse. Late in Akhenaten's reign, plague or epidemic hits the Near East, potentially reaching Egypt. Several royal family members disappear from the record. Succession becomes unclear. Akhenaten's promise of divine perfection begins unraveling. Within a few years of Akhenaten's death, his successors, Smenkhkare, Neferneferuaten, are short-lived. The capital is abandoned. Traditional gods return. Aten's temples are dismantled. Akhenaten's memory is condemned. Egypt engages in one of history's most thorough ideological reversions. The Amarna legacy, despite official erasure, the Amarna period leaves a lasting historical imprint. It reveals the limits of ideological centralization. It demonstrates how fragile even a wealthy empire becomes when foreign policy is neglected. It shows how powerful religious institutions can be, and how risky it is to attack them directly. And it gives us the most unusually self-expressive art in all of Egyptian history. Akhenaten's revolution lasts barely 2 decades, but it remains the most intense experiment in kingship ever attempted in the ancient world. Tutankhamun, I, and Horemheb, the restoration of order and the erasure of Amarna. The death of Akhenaten leaves Egypt with a fragmented empire, a destabilized priesthood, a paralyzed administration, and a capital built entirely around a theology that the country is no longer willing to follow. The next rulers, Tutankhamun, I, and Horemheb, confront the most delicate state reconstruction since the first intermediate period. Their job is not to innovate, but to restore. Restore the gods, restore foreign influence, restore administrative coherence, and restore Egypt's ideological spine. This is a period of reversal, but not regression. The state becomes stronger, by selectively absorbing lessons from the disaster that preceded it. Tutankhamun, the child king of a broken system. Tutankhamun ascends the throne at around age 9 under the name Tutankhaten, still reflecting Akhenaten's religious program. The regime around him, dominated by powerful advisors Ay and Horemheb, immediately begins reversing Atenite policies. By year 3, the young king changes his name to Tutankhamun, signaling a return to the old religious order. Tutankhamun himself is not an architect of policy. He is a symbol, a legitimizing figure used by experienced officials to guide Egypt out of ideological extremism. Nonetheless, the official decrees issued in his name are foundational to the restoration. Temples reopened and re-endowed. The restoration stele details how cults had been neglected, statues abandoned, shrines ruined, and offerings interrupted. Tutankhamun's regime restores priesthoods, repairs temples, and reallocates land back to traditional cults, especially Amun's. Administrative repair provincial governance is reorganized. Local officials regain titles abolished during the Amarna period. Temple treasuries are replenished. Records begin to flow again. Capital return. The seat of power shifts away from Amarna. Memphis and Thebes regain their central roles. Though Tutankhamun's reign is short, it accomplishes the core ideological pivot Egypt needs. Foreign relations, a system in need of triage. During Akhenaten's religious focus, Egypt's empire contracted. Canaanite vassals were lost. Hittites advanced into northern Syria. By Tutankhamun's time, Egypt begins repairing these networks, but lacks the military strength for large campaigns. An extraordinary episode, revealed in Hittite texts, shows the geopolitical fragility of this moment. After Tutankhamun's death, his widow, likely Ankhesenamun, writes to the Hittite king Suppiluliuma I, begging for a Hittite prince to marry her because she has no son and no other choice. This unprecedented act demonstrates how unstable the royal line had become. The Hittite prince sent to Egypt is murdered en route. Relations collapse. The episode highlights the vacuum of power left by the Amarna regime and the urgent need for strong leadership. I, the transitional power broker. A senior administrator, and likely a key figure during Amarna, rules briefly after Tutankhamun. His reign is an interlude, important but short. He performs the necessary ritual and ideological cleanup, but lacks the political force to fully restore Egypt's external authority. His influence lies in continuity, completing unfinished restoration efforts and allowing a smooth transition to someone capable of reshaping the state more aggressively. Horemheb, the general who rebuilds the state. Horemheb, once commander-in-chief under both Tutankhamun and I, becomes the restorer Egypt truly needs. He is not royal by birth, but his legitimacy comes from military authority, political acumen, and the desperate need for stability. His reforms are sweeping. 1. Administrative overhaul. Horemheb confronts corruption, inefficiency, and power vacuums. He issues decrees, punishing officials who extort peasants, rebuilding oversight of tax collection, reorganizing provincial governance, reasserting royal supervision over temples. This is state rehabilitation at the structural level. 2. Military rebalancing. Horemheb begins the restoration of Egypt's international posture, preparing the army for future campaigns. Although he does not launch massive wars himself, he rebuilds command structures and logistics. 3. The religious restoration. He aggressively reinstates the old pantheon, marginalizes Atenism, and restores Amun's priesthood. Temples damaged or neglected during Amarna are repaired. Statues destroyed by iconoclasm are replaced. 4. The erasure of Amarna. Horemheb views the Amarna era not as a misguided experiment, but as an existential wound. His strategy is twofold: erase Akhenaten, Smenkhkare, and possibly Neferneferuaten from king lists. Link himself directly to Amenhotep III in ideological succession. He is crafting historical memory as policy, ensuring the Amarna episode is treated as an interruption rather than a dynastic branch. Foundations for the Ramesside age Horemheb dies without an heir, appointing his vizier Paramessu as successor, who becomes Rameses I, founder of the 19th dynasty. This transition marks the beginning of the Ramesside period, militarized, monumental, and aggressively traditional. Tutankhamun, I, and Horemheb collectively restore Egypt not by regression, but by stabilization. They close the ideological rupture of Amarna and prepare the state for renewed imperial ambitions. Rameses I, Seti I, and Rameses II, the Ramesside ascendancy and the peak of imperial Egypt. The transition from the late 18th to the 19th dynasty marks Egypt's shift from restoration to aggressive resurgence. Horemheb's administrative repair work creates a political runway for the next rulers, but it is Rameses I, Seti I, and above all Rameses II, who turn Egypt back into a powerhouse, militarily assertive, architecturally overwhelming, and ideologically confident. This is the imperial peak, the moment when Egyptian ambition, wealth, and monumental propaganda align into a single, unmistakable, civilizational signature. Rameses, the 1-year recalibration. Rameses I rules briefly, c. 1292-1290 BCE, but his impact is structural. Hand-picked by Horemheb, he represents the new model of kingship, military elite elevated to ensure continuity. Though his reign is short, he establishes the 19th dynasty, appoints competent officials, and begins rebuilding Lower Egyptian administrative centers. His most important contribution is not what he builds, but whom he fathers. Seti the Mash, one of Egypt's greatest generals. Seti the Mumu, military revival and administrative precision. Seti the Y, c. 1290-1279 BCE, takes Egypt from stabilization to reassertion. His military campaigns rebuild the empire's northern influence after the gradual erosion during the Amarna period. Key achievements include reconquest of Canaan and Syria. Seti pushes Egyptian control deep into the Levant, defeating rebellious vassals and restoring influence over key city-states. His campaigns include clashes with the Hittites, who now dominate central Anatolia and northern Syria. Seti does not fully expel Hittite presence, but he re-establishes Egypt as a force to be reckoned with. Internal order and bureaucratic refinement. Seti strengthens provincial administration, enforces legal oversight, and maintains the military structures restored by Horemheb. Egypt, for the first time in decades, operates as a unified and confident state. Monumental building Seti is one of the great builders of the New Kingdom. His temple at Abydos becomes a masterwork of Ramesside art and theology. Karnak receives expansions, including the hypostyle hall, an architectural forest of columns that screams imperial confidence. Seti's reign is the hinge connecting the restored state to its forthcoming apex under his son. Rameses II, monumental ambition and the theater of empire. Rameses II, c. 1279-1213 BCE, known as Rameses the Great, is the embodiment of the Ramesside era. Energetic, aggressive, propagandistic, prolific in building, prolific in fathering, and dedicated to the idea that the king's name must be everywhere, always, preferably carved in stone, large enough to survive multiple apocalypses. Rameses II's reign spans 66 years, during which Egypt reaches its imperial zenith, culturally, diplomatically, and architecturally. 1. The Battle of Kadesh, propaganda as victory. The Battle of Kadesh, c. 1274 BCE, is the signature event of his military career. Fighting the Hittites at Kadesh in Syria, Rameses marches into an expertly laid ambush. His near disaster is transformed via monumental inscriptions into a heroic narrative of personal courage, royal intervention, and divine rescue. What matters is not the tactical outcome, a stalemate, but the propaganda machine that turns the event into Egypt's most famous military text. Kadesh becomes a brand. 2. The first known peace treaty. Years later, Ramesses II signs the Egyptian-Hittite peace treaty, the earliest surviving international treaty. It establishes mutual non-aggression, extradition agreements, diplomatic parity between the great kings of Egypt and Hatti. This treaty stabilizes the Levant and allows both empires to focus on internal affairs. 3. Monumental construction on an unprecedented scale. Ramesses II's building program dwarfs that of most pharaohs combined. Highlights include Abu Simbel, with colossal seated statues projecting authority into Nubia, the Ramesseum, his mortuary temple, a grand statement of royal legacy, major expansions at Karnak and Luxor temples, stelae, obelisks, and statues throughout Egypt and Nubia. Ramesses II's aesthetic philosophy is simple: permanence equals power. His monuments anchor his reign into the landscape so thoroughly that erasing him becomes functionally impossible. 4. Domestic and administrative strength. Under Ramesses, Egypt enjoys stable borders, trade networks flourish, temples accumulate enormous wealth, the state's population grows, a massive labor and military class develops. Although later in his reign, signs of over-centralization appear, tax pressure, debt, and resource strain, his administration remains functional due to strong bureaucratic traditions inherited from earlier dynasties. Empire at full expression. Under Seti I and Ramesses II, Egypt perfects the imperial model. Military power is continuous but strategic. Diplomacy is sophisticated. Tribute flows steadily. Administration is organized and resilient. Monumental art projects, ideological permanence, religion reinforces state authority through Amun and royal cults. This is the apex. Egypt at its most confident, wealthy, and internationally connected. But peaks imply slopes. Ramesses II's successors will inherit not only his glory, but the systemic strains hidden beneath it. The late Ramesside decline, the Sea Peoples, and the Great Bronze Age collapse. The long 19th dynasty glow left by Ramesses II does not last. His successors inherit an empire stretched thin, militarily, economically, and administratively. Egypt is still powerful, but the system is rigid, overextended, and increasingly unable to adapt to rapid geopolitical and environmental changes. The late Ramesside era becomes a story of slow internal decay, external pressures from the Sea Peoples, and Egypt's struggle to survive the wider Bronze Age collapse that destabilizes nearly every major power of the Eastern Mediterranean. The problem of successors, the burden of a 66-year reign. Ramesses II lives long enough to outlast many of his heirs, leaving the throne to his 13th son, Meremptah. Meremptah is competent but inherits a military stretched across Levantine garrisons, rising Libyan incursions in the Delta Grain, shortages influenced by climate irregularities, a bureaucracy accustomed to Ramesses II's resources, but without Ramesses II's charisma. Meremptah wins a key battle against Libyan forces and allied groups from the Aegean, producing the famous Israel Stele, the earliest Egyptian reference to a people later known as Israel. But his victories only mask the deeper truth. Egypt is defending itself more often than projecting power. The last Ramessides and the drift toward instability. After Meremptah's brief stability, the throne becomes the plaything of rival factions. The late 19th dynasty cycles through short-lived pharaohs. Succession disputes erupt, legitimacy fractures. Economic records reveal mounting shortages, corruption, and provincial autonomy. By the time the 20th dynasty begins with Setnacht, Egypt is no longer an assertive imperial state. It is a defensive one. His son, Ramesses III, Kos 1186-1155 BCE, is the last great king of the new kingdom and the final pharaoh capable of mounting a coherent imperial defense. The Sea Peoples, migrants, raiders, or collapsing kingdoms on the move. The Sea Peoples, a modern label for various groups recorded in Egyptian inscriptions, are not a single ethnicity. They are a constellation of displaced populations, warriors, and migrants moving across the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean during a period of system-wide collapse. Their origins are debated, but their impact is unmistakable. They destroy the Hittite Empire. They devastate coastal cities in the Levant. They destabilize Cyprus. They attempt to penetrate Egypt from both land and sea. Ramesses III faces them at a moment when Egypt is already weakened economically and suffering from internal corruption. Ramesses III, defender of a crumbling world. Ramesses III wins two major conflicts against the Sea Peoples: a land battle in Sinai, stopping groups attempting to enter through the northeast; a naval battle in the Delta, one of the earliest recorded naval engagements in history. Egyptian forces lure the enemy ships into a trap, using archers and marines positioned along the Nile's branches. These victories are monumental. They prevent Egypt from meeting the same fate as the Hittites, Mycenaeans, and many Canaanite city-states. Ramesses III manages to stabilize the kingdom temporarily. But stabilizing is not the same as recovering. His reign reveals cracks too large to patch. Workers at Deir el-Medina stage the first recorded labor strike in history due to ration shortages. Grain distributions falter. Prices inflate dramatically, as shown in surviving ostraca. Tomb robberies proliferate. The court becomes embroiled in conspiracies, including the infamous Harem conspiracy, an assassination attempt against the king himself. Ramesses III wins battles, but loses the long war against systemic depletion. The Great Bronze Age collapse and Egypt's narrow escape. While Egypt survives the collapse militarily, it pays a heavy price. After Ramesses III, territorial holdings in Canaan shrink dramatically. Egypt withdraws southward, abandoning many imperial garrisons. Foreign tribute dries up. Trade networks with Syria and Cyprus disintegrate. The army becomes underfunded and increasingly reliant on foreign mercenaries. The late Ramesside pharaohs, Ramesses IV through Ramesses II, rule a kingdom that looks stable on monumental inscriptions, but deeply unstable in administrative documents. The end of the New Kingdom. By the end of the 20th dynasty, the priesthood of Amun at Thebes becomes nearly independent. The Delta falls under the influence of military strongmen. Central authority erodes beyond repair. What began as a vibrant imperial system ends as a fragmented landscape, where priests, generals, and regional elites compete for power. Egypt does not fall at the end of the New Kingdom. It fractures, setting the stage for the political pluralism and foreign influence that dominate the next centuries. The Third Intermediate Period, Libyan dynasties, and the deep fragmentation of Egypt. The Third Intermediate Period, c. 1069-1664 BCE, is Egypt's long descent into structural pluralism, political fragmentation, competing dynasties, foreign influence, and shifting centers of power. What begins as a divided kingdom ruled simultaneously by pharaohs in the Delta and high priests in Thebes becomes a multi-layered puzzle of Libyan lineages, regional strongmen, and short-lived reunification attempts. Egypt is no longer an empire. It is a post-imperial landscape struggling to redefine legitimacy in a world where wealth and military strength no longer flow automatically from a unified Nile Valley. The Libyan element, from mercenaries to kings. For generations during the late New Kingdom, Egypt relied heavily on Libyan mercenaries, particularly the Meshwesh and Libu, to supplement its military forces. These groups settled in the western delta, gradually integrating into local society while retaining strong clan structures. By the start of the Third Intermediate Period, their descendants are commanders of regional garrisons, holders of powerful military administrative titles, wealthy, landowning elites, deeply embedded in the delta's political fabric. Their rise is not an abrupt takeover, but the natural consequence of a weakened central state, relying on foreigners for stability. The 21st Dynasty, kings in Tanis and priests in Thebes. After the collapse of the New Kingdom, the throne passes to Smendes, founder of the 21st Dynasty, who rules from Tanis in the delta. Meanwhile, in Upper Egypt, power belongs to the high priests of Amun at Thebes. These priests command vast temple estates, military forces, and ideological authority. The country is functionally divided. North, Tanis, political kingship; south, Thebes, religious and de facto regional kingship. Crucially, this arrangement is not purely antagonistic. The two centers intermarry, cooperate in burials, and share ideological frameworks. Egypt is divided, but it is a negotiated division. The 22nd Dynasty, the Libyans, take the throne. The balance shifts when Shoshenq I, a high-ranking Libyan commander of Meshwesh ancestry, founds the 22nd Dynasty, c. 945 BCE. This marks the formal ascendancy of Libyan rulers. Shoshenq consolidates power by reorganizing provincial governance, appointing family members to high priesthoods, strengthening the military, campaigning into Judah and Israel, recorded on the Bubastite portal at Karnak. For a brief moment, Shoshenq produces something resembling national reunification, but his successors lack his political acumen, and hereditary fragmentation soon re-emerges. The pendulum of power. Rival Libyan houses. After Shoshenq woe, the Libyan dynasties multiply. 22nd Dynasty in Bubastis, Tanis. 23rd Dynasty, emerging from Leontopolis. Regional chiefs asserting semi-independent authority. Egypt becomes a mosaic of overlapping Libyan houses, all claiming legitimacy through traditional pharaonic titles, but exercising power regionally. The result is polycentric kingship, multiple rulers simultaneously using full royal titulary without controlling the entire country. The rise of local strongmen and regional identities. By the mid-Third Intermediate Period, the delta is partitioned into competing Libyan chiefdoms. The Theban priesthood experiences waves of decline and resurgence. Nubian influences grow increasingly prominent from the south. Foreign mercenaries continue to form a significant portion of Egypt's armies. This fragmentation is not pure chaos. It is a political ecology in which authority is negotiated regionally rather than imposed nationally. The late 23rd and early 24th dynasties, microstates and diminishing horizons. The later Libyan dynasties lose control over major trade routes. Temple wealth declines. Local elites accumulate autonomy. The 24th dynasty in Sais, founded by Tefnacht, briefly attempts reunification, but cannot overpower Thebes or the other Libyan houses. Egypt's political identity shrinks from empire to region-state, and eventually to a collection of competing microstates. The past grandeur of the New Kingdom becomes ideological currency rather than political reality. Why the Libyan period matters. Despite its fragmentation, the Third Intermediate Period is transformative. It normalizes non-Egyptian dynasties ruling Egypt. It demonstrates that pharaonic legitimacy can be shared, duplicated, or regionally constrained. It creates the environment that enables Nubian expansion from the south. It accelerates Egypt's shift from imperial power to regional participant in a larger Near Eastern system. The Libyan dynasty era is Egypt learning, sometimes painfully, that kingship is not a birthright, but a system that must be continuously maintained. When that maintenance fails, fragmentation is the rule, not the exception. The next segment brings a new force into the story: Nubia, whose kings will attempt to restore Egypt by conquering it. The Nubian, Kushite. 25th Dynasty, reunification, revival, and the Assyrian confrontation. By the time Egypt enters the mid-8th century BCE, its political landscape is fractured beyond the capacity of local elites to restore. The Libyan dynasties have splintered into rival chiefdoms. The Theban priesthood remains influential, but lacks the military strength to unify the land. Foreign powers, Assyria above all, are expanding aggressively across the Near East. Egypt is no longer a protagonist in regional politics. It is a stage where stronger states prepare to compete. Into this vacuum steps a force Egypt had once dominated: Nubia, or Kush, centered at Napata near the Fourth Cataract. For centuries, Egypt influenced Nubian culture, religion, and kingship. Now the roles reverse. The rise of the Kushite state, a mirror of Egyptian ideology. Nubia had not been idle during Egypt's fragmentation. The Kushite kings develop a strong, centralized monarchy, wealth from gold mines and trade routes, a religious ideology focused on Amun of Napata, a court culture heavily infused with earlier Egyptian traditions. Ironically, Nubia preserves Egyptian ideological unity more faithfully than Egypt itself. The kings see themselves not as outsiders, but as the legitimate heirs of Egyptian kingship. Piye Pianki, the first step toward reunification. The dynasty's founder in Egypt, Piye, c. 744-714 BCE, does not invade for plunder. He intervenes to restore order in a land he views as spiritually compromised. His famous victory stela describes a ritualized campaign. Piye marches north to stop Libyan warlords from tearing the country apart. Piye's approach combines military force, religious legitimacy, diplomatic pressure, ideological messaging. He defeats Nimlot, Tefnacht, and other Delta chiefs, but after receiving their submission, he returns to Nubia rather than governing directly. Egypt is reunified symbolically, but not structurally. Still, Piye establishes the precedent. Nubia is now the arbiter of Egyptian legitimacy. Shabaka, full conquest and the birth of dynasty. 25. Piye's brother and successor, Shabaka, c. 716-702 BCE, finishes what Piye began. He takes Memphis, extinguishes the remaining Libyan dynasties, and establishes the 25th dynasty as the ruling house of all Egypt. Shabaka is not a conqueror in the typical sense. He presents himself as a restorer, rebuilding religious centers, revitalizing temples, reintroducing older artistic styles, positioning Amun as supreme deity. He even preserves older Egyptian texts, most famously the Memphite theology, by commissioning new copies. His rule is a deliberate cultural revival, a return to Middle Kingdom classicism filtered through Nubian perspectives. Shebitku and Taharqa, the new zenith and a new threat. Under Shebitku and especially Taharqa, the reunified Egypt-Nubia kingdom becomes a major power. Temples at Karnak and across Nubia expand dramatically. Monumental building flourishes. The state is wealthy, stable, and ideologically coherent. Taharqa, c. 690 or 664 BCE, is particularly significant. His reign is characterized by a large-scale building program rivaling earlier New Kingdom rulers, prosperity fueled by Nile floods, and strong administration, renewed influence in the Levant. But Egypt's revival coincides with the rise of a far more aggressive neighbor, the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Assyria, the industrial-scale war machine. While Egypt and Nubia are conducting ideological restoration, Assyria is conducting geopolitical consolidation. Iron weaponry, professionalized armies, siege engines, logistics systems unmatched in the ancient world. Assyria views Egyptian support for Levantine states as hostile interference. conflict becomes inevitable. The Assyrian confrontation, from resilience to defeat. Taharqa supports anti-Assyrian coalitions in Judah and other Levantine states. Assyria responds with overwhelming force. Key phases: Esarhaddon's campaign, 671 BCE. Assyria invades Egypt, defeats Taharqa, and captures Memphis. Taharqa retreats south to Nubia. Taharqa's return attempt. Taharqa attempts to retake Egypt. Assyria retaliates again, forcing him permanently out of the delta. Tutankhamun's last stand. Taharqa's successor. Tutankhamun briefly recaptures parts of Upper and Lower Egypt. Assyria responds with a devastating campaign, pushing Nubian forces back beyond Thebes. By 664 BCE, Assyrians sack Thebes, a psychological blow unmatched since the Hyksos era. The Nubian rulers retreat to Napata permanently, the legacy of Dynasty 25. Despite their defeat, the Kushite rulers leave a profound mark. They restore political and cultural unity after centuries of fragmentation. They preserve and revive classical Egyptian forms. They solidify Amun's ideological centrality. Their rule legitimizes the idea that Egypt can be governed from beyond its traditional borders. Their fall is not a collapse of Egypt itself, but a transition. After the Assyrian withdrawal, a new local dynasty, the Site Kings of Dynasty 26, will rise in the Delta, using Egyptian-Assyrian diplomacy to forge a final era of independence. The Site Renaissance, Dynasty 26, revival, reform, and the Persian conquest. With the withdrawal of the Assyrians and the retreat of the Nubian 25th dynasty, Egypt enters a final, concentrated phase of political revival under the Site Dynasty 26, c. 664–525 BCE. Centered at Sais in the western delta, this dynasty achieves something extraordinary. A unified, stable, economically revitalized Egypt, emerging from 3 centuries of fragmentation. It is a renaissance, brief, intense, and strategically brilliant. But it unfolds in a world increasingly dominated by empires far larger and more coordinated than Egypt has ever faced. First Assyria, then Babylon, and finally Persia, whose rise will define Egypt's fate. Psamtik was the architect of revival. Psamtik Wamn, 664–610 BCE, is the founder of Egypt's last great native dynasty. Installed initially under Assyrian auspices, he quickly transforms nominal authority into actual sovereignty. His strategy combines diplomacy with Assyria. He preserves Assyrian goodwill long enough to rebuild internal structures. Alliance and outreach to Greek powers. Egypt recruits Greek mercenaries, uses them to break Libyan and local opponents, and integrates them into military colonies like Naucratis. Reunification of Upper and Lower Egypt. By defeating remaining regional rulers and negotiating with powerful Theban priests, Psamtik restores true territorial unity for the first time since the New Kingdom. Administrative reset. He revives centralized bureaucracy, re-establishes provincial boundaries, and curtails the hereditary powers that destabilized earlier dynasties. Psamtik I's reforms work because they are realistic, a mix of soft power, foreign support, and ideological continuity. A cultural and artistic renaissance. The Sate period consciously revives Old Kingdom and Middle Kingdom styles, a form of curated classicism. Sculpture returns to archasing poses and proportions. Tomb inscriptions echo earlier linguistic forms. Officials imitate biographies from the classical ages of Egypt. This deliberate revival is ideological. Sais presents itself not as a new power, but as a restorer of Egypt's timeless identity. Temple building intensifies across the Nile Valley. The priesthood of Ninth at Sais gains prominence, while Amun's clergy retain influence, but under firmer royal control. Egypt looks backward to move forward, an approach rooted in stability rather than innovation. Foreign relations, a delicate balancing act. The world beyond Egypt is volatile. Assyria collapses. Babylonian and Median forces destroy Nineveh. New empires emerge in quick succession. Egypt navigates this chaos by forming alliances against Babylon, supporting Judah and other Levantine states as buffers, using Greek mercenaries to strengthen its military, maintaining a diplomatic presence across the Mediterranean. But these efforts strain Egypt's resources and entangle it in Near Eastern conflicts. It is no longer strong enough to dominate. Necho II. Ambition meets geopolitical reality. Necho II, 610–595 BCE, continues Saite expansionism, builds fleets manned by Phoenician sailors, launches canal projects linking the Nile to the Red Sea, expands trade with Greek and Near Eastern states, campaigns in the Levant to counter Babylonian influence. His forces win early victories. But at Carchemish, 605 BCE, the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar II inflict a decisive defeat. This battle ends Egypt's aspirations in Syria for good. Despite this failure, the Saite kingdom remains prosperous and internally stable. Psamtik II and Apris, tension and decline. Psamtik II campaigns in Nubia, projecting power south of the First Cataract. His successor, Apris, Hofra, however, faces internal unrest after military failures abroad. Civil conflict erupts, and the general Amasis, Ahmose II, takes power. Amasis stabilizes the state, cultivates Greek alliances, and oversees a final period of prosperity. Greek communities flourish in Naucratis. Trade intensifies. Egypt remains wealthy but now deeply integrated into Mediterranean geopolitics. This wealth makes Egypt attractive, fatally so, to its new eastern neighbor. Persia. Ascendant, a new type of empire. The rise of the Achaemenid Persian Empire reshapes the ancient world. Under Cyrus the Great, Persia conquers Lydia and Babylon. Egypt becomes the last major independent kingdom in the Near East. Amasis's death comes at the worst possible moment. His inexperienced successor, Psamtik III, inherits a kingdom strong on paper, but structurally vulnerable. Cambyses II and the conquest of Egypt, 525 BCE. Persia invades under Cambyses II, crossing Sinai and defeating Egyptian forces at Pelusium, a battle remembered for its psychological warfare and its lopsided outcome. Key reasons for Egypt's defeat: Persian logistical superiority, use of Greek mercenaries on both sides, internal dissent among Egyptian elites, a vastly larger Persian imperial structure capable of sustained campaigns. Memphis falls quickly. Psamtik III is captured. Egypt becomes a Persian province, satrapy of Mudraya. The Saite legacy. Even under foreign rule, the memory of the Saite Renaissance endures. It restores a stable, unified Egyptian state after centuries of fragmentation. It revives classical forms that influence Egyptian identity long after independence is lost. It demonstrates remarkable adaptability in diplomacy, administration, and culture. But the lesson is structural. Even a unified Egypt cannot compete with the new scale of empire emerging across Eurasia. Persia's conquest marks the definitive end of Egypt's autonomy as a great power and the beginning of a new phase, cyclical foreign rule. The Persian periods, imperial rule, revolts, and Egypt's repeated struggle for independence. The Persian conquest in 525 BCE marks a decisive transformation. Egypt becomes a province within the Achaemenid Empire, the largest political entity the Near East had ever seen. For the first time since Narmer, Egypt is not governed by a pharaoh rooted in its own land, ideology, or elites. Instead, it becomes Mudraya, a satrapy managed from afar, integrated into a centralized imperial system whose goals rarely align with Egyptian tradition. Yet the story of Persian rule is not one of passive subordination. Across nearly 2 centuries, Egypt repeatedly attempts to break free, launching rebellions, backing local dynasts and exploiting imperial instability. These periods of resistance are crucial. They reveal both Egypt's enduring ambition for autonomy and the structural impossibility of maintaining it in the face of world-scale empires. Cambyses II and the Achaemenid administrative machine. Cambyses II rules Egypt not as a destroyer, but as a pragmatic sovereign. Persian policy generally allows subject peoples to keep their religion, their laws, their priesthoods, their local elites, so long as they pay tribute and remain loyal. Egyptian temples receive endowments, priestly privileges are reinstated, administrative systems continue with Persian oversight. But resentment simmers. Foreign rule violates sacred notions of kingship. Persian administrators, though often effective, are outsiders. Heavy tribute feeds imperial coffers, not Egyptian temples. Egypt tolerates Persian rule, but does not accept it. Darius I. Efficient, organized, and deeply unpopular. Darius II, 522-486 BCE, is the Achaemenid ruler who integrates Egypt most thoroughly. He restores irrigation systems, including canal works linking the Nile to the Red Sea. He codifies legal procedures. He supports temple rebuilding. Yet his efficiency reinforces Egypt's status as a dependent province. Persian imperial ideology leaves no room for Egyptian-style divine kingship. To Egyptians, Darius is a foreign ruler who performs kingship without embodying it. The structure works administratively, but fails ideologically. The first revolts, Egyptian memory versus imperial reality. Resistance emerges almost immediately. In 486 BCE, upon the death of Darius, Egypt revolts. Xerxes I suppresses the uprising and, unlike his father, adopts harsher measures. Priesthoods lose privileges, taxes increase, anti-Persian sentiment deepens. This begins a cycle. Every moment of weakness in the Persian Empire produces a rebellion in Egypt. A brief return to independence, 28th, 30th dynasties. Between 404 and 343 BCE, Egypt briefly reclaims independence through three native dynasties. 28th dynasty, Amyrtaeus, a single king dynasty, makes independence real but fragile. 29th dynasty, Mendesian kings, a period of political maneuvering, diplomacy with Greek states, and efforts to strengthen Egypt's defensive capacity. 30th dynasty, Nectanebo IV and the Seku, the last native dynasty of Egypt. They revitalize temples, rebuild fortifications, and engage in alliances with Greek powers against Persia. Nectanebo II is especially energetic, funding extensive building projects and attempting to unify Egypt ideologically. This final renaissance echoes earlier revivals, Site, Theban, Kushite, but lacks the structural strength needed to withstand the full might of Persia restored. The Second Persian Conquest, 343 BCE. Persia regains strength under Artaxerxes III, who launches a concentrated campaign against Egypt. Greek mercenaries, once Egypt's secret weapon, now serve on both sides. The delta defenses collapse. Nectanebo II flees to Nubia. Egypt is now once again under Persian control, entering the Second Persian period, 343-332 BCE. Persian administration becomes harsher, partly out of strategic necessity, partly out of repeated Egyptian defiance. Why independence fails? Egypt's repeated revolts show determination, but the geopolitical realities are insurmountable. Egypt's population and resources are substantial, but not on the scale of Persia. The empire can deploy multi-front armies, large fleets, and enormous financial reserves. Egypt's defensive geography, once an advantage, becomes a liability when enemies possess better naval and siege capabilities. Internal divisions, Delta versus Upper Egypt, priesthood versus crown, limit sustained resistance. Greek mercenaries are expensive, unreliable, and prone to switching employers. Egypt can assert autonomy temporarily, but cannot sustain it against a continental empire. The stage is set for another conqueror. As the Persian Empire enters terminal crisis in the late 4th century BCE, Egypt sees opportunity. But before any native dynasty can rise again, a new world power arrives, one whose speed, ambition, and charisma will alter Egypt permanently. Alexander the Great. The Persian period ends not with rebellion, but with a conquest from the outside that reshapes Egyptian identity for centuries. Alexander the Great, the early Ptolemies, and the transformation of the Egyptian state. The arrival of Alexander the Great in 332 BCE marks one of the most consequential transitions in Egyptian history. After centuries of foreign domination, Assyrian, Persian, and intermittent native revivals, Egypt encounters a conqueror whose ambitions extend beyond tribute and administration. Alexander brings a new political language, a new cultural synthesis, and a new model of kingship that will reshape the country's identity for nearly 3 centuries under the Ptolemaic dynasty. This is not merely a change of rulers, it is a systemic transformation of Egypt's economic base, administrative structures, cultural institutions, and international connections. Alexander the Great, conquest as rebranding. Alexander enters Egypt as a liberator. Unlike the Persians, whose rule Egyptians viewed as ideologically incompatible, Alexander presents himself as a restorer of traditional Egyptian religion, a champion of Amun, a legitimate pharaoh. He visits the oracle of Amun at Siwa, where he is declared son of the god. The symbolism is powerful. He aligns Macedonian kingship with Egyptian divine ideology. He then founds Alexandria, a city that will become the economic heart of Ptolemaic Egypt, a hub of Mediterranean trade, a center of Hellenistic culture, the greatest intellectual capital of the ancient world. Alexander does not stay long. After leaving Egypt in 331 BCE, he never returns. But the foundations he lays will define Egyptian governance for centuries. The early Ptolemies, strategic continuity and calculated innovation. Upon Alexander's death in 323 BCE, his empire fragments. Egypt falls to Ptolemy the Firm, one of Alexander's generals. Initially a satrap, Ptolemy declares himself king in 305 BCE, founding the Ptolemaic dynasty 305-30 BCE. The Ptolemies govern with a dual strategy. 1. Maintain Egyptian religious legitimacy. They adopt traditional titulary, participate in temple building, and present themselves as pharaohs in Egyptian contexts. Temples across the Nile Valley flourish. Philae edfu kom ombo dendera. These structures express classical Egyptian religious forms with unprecedented scale and Hellenistic architectural influence. The message is clear. In Egypt, we are Egyptians. 2. Reinvent the state through Hellenistic administration. Outside the temples, the Ptolemies create a radically different system. A Greek-speaking bureaucratic elite, centralized fiscal control, monetized taxation, state monopolies on key industries, papyrus, oil, beer, linen, a professional standing army with Greek, Macedonian, and mercenary units. This is no longer the old Egyptian state. It is a Hellenistic fiscal military machine, one of the most efficient and extractive in the ancient world. The Ptolemies understand something earlier, conquerors did not. Egypt's agricultural wealth, if tightly organized, can fund continental ambitions. Ptolemy and the Septuagint, building an imperial capital. Ptolemy transforms Alexandria into a cosmopolitan megacity. Ptolemy II continues this work with unprecedented cultural investment. The Library of Alexandria, a center of scholarship, translation, astronomy, mathematics, and literary production. The Mausoleum, a research institution that attracts intellectuals from across the Mediterranean. A royal court that blends Macedonian prestige with Egyptian divine kingship. Alexandria becomes the intellectual lighthouse of the ancient world. Greek science, Egyptian cosmology, and Near Eastern knowledge converge into a single, hybrid intellectual system. Administrative transformation, the birth of the Ptolemaic economy. The Ptolemaic state is a highly centralized, data-driven operation. Census records, agricultural surveys, tax registers, labor quotas, grain logistics, state-run workshops, regulated trade routes. Nothing like this existed in earlier Egyptian history. The state now controls who farms, what is planted, how much is harvested, where it is shipped, how it is taxed. The Ptolemies turn Egypt into a profitable engine, capable of sustaining armies, navies, and regional hegemony. This system is the backbone of their power, but also the source of future unrest. Cultural transformation toward a hybrid Egypt. Though Greeks dominate administration and Alexandria's cultural life, the countryside remains deeply Egyptian. The Ptolemies eventually embrace this duality. Greeks assimilate into Egyptian religious life. Egyptians adopt aspects of Hellenistic culture. New hybrid deities emerge, most famously Serapis, engineered to appeal to both Greeks and Egyptians. Bilingual texts appear, hieroglyphic, demotic, and Greek side by side. This mixture produces the uniquely syncretic identity of Ptolemaic Egypt. The early Ptolemies as Mediterranean powers. Ptolemy I and II project Egypt outward. Naval supremacy in the eastern Mediterranean. Influence in the Aegean and Asia Minor control of strategic ports. Diplomatic marriages and alliances. Egypt re-enters the international stage, not as an empire of conquest like in the New Kingdom, but as a maritime Hellenistic power. The nature of the transformation. The early Ptolemies do not simply rule Egypt, they re-engineer it. Kingship becomes bicultural. The economy becomes monetized and centralized. Alexandria becomes the intellectual heart of the world. Egyptian temples flourish even under foreign monarchy. Administrative systems evolve beyond anything in earlier dynasties. This is one of the most profound shifts in Egypt's long history. Not collapse, but reinvention. The stage is now set for the final chapter, the later Ptolemies, Cleopatra, and the Roman conquest. The late Ptolemies, Cleopatra VII, and the Roman annexation of Egypt. By the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE, the Ptolemaic kingdom is no longer the confident, wealthy, expansionist state shaped by Ptolemy II. It is instead a fragile, internally fractured monarchy caught between the rising superpowers of the Mediterranean. The late Ptolemies rule a country still rich, but strained by dynastic infighting, economic inequality, dependence on foreign military support, and an increasingly intrusive Roman Republic that understands Egypt's strategic value better than Egypt's own kings. Into this world steps Cleopatra VII, the last ruler of ancient Egypt, whose intelligence, political audacity, and diplomatic skill represent a final attempt to reclaim autonomy in a geopolitical arena. Egypt can no longer dominate. The late Ptolemies, a dynasty consuming itself. The internal problems of the late Ptolemaic court are legendary. Brother-sister rivalries escalate into war. Co-regencies collapse into assassinations or exiles. Court factions weaponize Roman alliances against one another. Economic pressure increases as corruption and centralized monopolies deepen. The Hashuwai kingdom still commands immense agricultural wealth. Egypt remains the grain capital of the Mediterranean, but its rulers lose control over the political machinery that earlier Ptolemies managed with precision. Two core dynamics define the period: dependence on Roman arbitration. The Ptolemies repeatedly ask Rome to settle succession disputes. Rome obliges because the price of intervention is influence. Growing Roman strategic appetite. Egypt's resources, ports, and geographic position are too valuable to ignore. Roman senators begin treating Egypt not as a sovereign kingdom, but as an asset to be secured. By the time Cleopatra ascends the throne, the Ptolemaic state is a monarchy in form, but in practice, a client kingdom. Cleopatra VII, a last attempt at independent kingship. Cleopatra VII, 5130 BCE, inherits a throne shared, reluctantly, with her younger brother Ptolemy III. From the beginning, her strategy is clear: strengthen the monarchy through direct, charismatic rule, restore Egypt's autonomy by manipulating Roman power politics, rebuild the financial foundations of the state, reassert pharaonic legitimacy with traditional religious roles. Cleopatra is not a romantic figure first. She is a political strategist shaped by a dynasty known for cutting its enemies down before breakfast. Her early confrontation with Ptolemy III triggers a civil conflict. Cleopatra is expelled, rallies forces in Syria, and returns at the precise moment Julius Caesar arrives in Alexandria to settle the succession dispute. Cleopatra and Caesar. Alliance in a collapsing republic. Cleopatra's partnership with Caesar is politically calculated. Caesar restores her to the throne. Egypt provides him with grain and economic resources. Cleopatra bears him a son, Caesarion, symbolically linking Egypt to Rome's most powerful figure. The famous romance is less important than the geopolitical fact. Cleopatra positions Egypt alongside Caesar in the Roman Civil War. When he is assassinated in 44 BCE, she loses her primary shield. The Mark Antony alliance, last gamble against Rome. Cleopatra allies next with Mark Antony, one of the three most powerful men in the post-Caesar Roman world. Their political and personal partnership becomes the final attempt to create a Roman-Egyptian power bloc, a restored Eastern Empire, a sphere of influence independent from Octavian, the future Augustus. Antony's military command and Cleopatra's vast resources form a plausible challenge to Octavian's ambitions, until the political tides turn. The alliance provokes Rome's propaganda machine. Cleopatra is portrayed as a foreign seductress. Antony is painted as her puppet. Octavian positions himself as defender of Roman values. The conflict becomes ideological as much as military. Actium and the Endgame. In 31 BCE, the naval Battle of Actium determines Egypt's fate. Antony and Cleopatra's combined forces are defeated by Octavian's admiral, Agrippa. The battle is not a dramatic annihilation, but a controlled collapse of morale and logistics. Antony and Cleopatra retreat to Alexandria. Octavian follows. In 30 BCE, Antony commits suicide after military defeat. Cleopatra, denied negotiations, commits suicide soon after, most likely by poison, not the romanticized snakebite myth. Caesarion is captured and executed. Egypt falls without prolonged resistance. Its elites recognize that the Ptolemaic system is finished. Roman annexation. Egypt as imperial crown jewel. Octavian annexes Egypt as his personal possession, the only province ruled directly by the emperor himself. Its grain flows into Rome, feeding the capital. Its wealth funds imperial administration. Its temples continue to function, but under Roman oversight. Egypt is no longer a kingdom. It is now a strategic province, an economic engine, a cultural hybrid deeply transformed by centuries of foreign rule. Roman governance preserves aspects of Egyptian tradition, but the pharaonic line ends with Cleopatra. The dynastic system that began with Narmer over 3,000 years earlier dissolves into the Roman imperial order. The final transformation. The Ptolemaic era ends not with cultural collapse, but with political absorption into a larger system. The story of Cleopatra and Rome is not the fall of Egyptian civilization. It is the fall of Egyptian sovereignty. Temples, language, religious traditions, and local elites continue under Roman rule, but the structural autonomy of Egypt as a unified, self-governing state ends here. Cleopatra's reign represents the last, brilliant attempt to manipulate global power in Egypt's favor. The failure of that attempt ends the longest continuous political tradition in world history. And that's the full arc. 3 millennia of kings, conquerors, reforms, collapses, revivals, mistakes, experiments, and ambitions carved into stone and buried in sand. If you made it through every dynasty, every kingdom, every political mutation, congratulations. You now know more Egyptian history than most of the pharaohs who lived it. If you want more deep dive, historically precise chaos like this, subscribe to Ancient Absurdity and join us for the next civilizational autopsy.